Hello and thank you all for joining us today for this educational Innovyze webinar. My name is Caitlin Nyan and I'm part of the marketing team here in the Innovyze Portland office. In this webinar, we'll discuss what gutter spread and inlet capacity are, why they occur, and how to get the best handle on what will happen when it rains. For those of you who may not be familiar with Innovyze, we have a long history of providing high-performing, innovative software solutions. Our intention is to make sure that in your work, you can design, model, review, and manage with confidence. This also means that we strive to provide excellent customer service and support, and that we offer continuing education opportunities like these for engineers and others in our industry. Innovyze offers a library of software programs for the design, analysis, and management of water infrastructure, including powerful storm and flooding modeling software like XPDRAINAGE, which you will see today. Now on with our presentation. I'd like to introduce our presenter. Today's presenter is Zach Sample, our Stormwater Products Manager. He has over 10 years civil engineering experience in site design, stormwater planning, and hydraulic analysis. Zach has performed a number of advanced water resource studies, including hydraulic and water quality system assessments, as well as 1D and 2D hydraulic river and floodplain studies. During this time with XP Solutions and Innovyze, Zach has helped hundreds of clients with their models, conducted training courses, and led the development of stormwater design software, XPDRAINAGE. Thank you again for joining us. Would you like to start a discussion, Zach?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Caitlin. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'll jump right in. So the billing for this webinar is to talk about inlet stuff, inlet design, gutter spread, so on and so forth. So we're going to start with just some real high-level basics of what in the world these items are, and then get into a bit of the workflows that most people who ever encounter this are living in, and maybe something that we can do now with maybe some different tools. So the very first thing I want to do, I want to launch a poll. I think did it in the morning. I think it's really useful for everyone to kind of see who's joining the webinar. So I'm going to launch a poll. Everyone can interact with. Go ahead and jump in. And basically, does anyone do this now? So the one extreme is every single project someone has involves designing of inlets and figuring out the gutter spread. Other extreme is no, I've never seen this, but I really want to learn. That's why I'm here. Obviously, in the middle, there's more, probably where most people will land, right? That it might be pretty common to calculate spread as a requirement, especially on roadway projects, but that might not be every single project you have. Looks like we're pretty quickly getting almost everyone in here. Take a second to check the box, tick the field, and I'll share this in a moment. All right, I'm going to share this now. So close and I'll share that out so everyone can see. Pretty expected makeup here. There are some people that really haven't had, well, I don't know if I'll call it an opportunity. Some people might not think of it like that, but might not have a lot of experience with this, so they want to learn. The vast majority of people either do this very, very, very regularly, if not all the time, or it's certainly something that comes up. So really high level, what are we talking about? So to start, this is really a lot of roadway situational work. So here is a typical streetscape. I could have picked a million of these different cross sections, but here is a street profile. Again, very high level, right? But when it rains, water is going to hit that road and drain to what we're going to call the gutter of the road. All right, so here would be the gutter of the roadway, and I'll get a laser pen to show, right? Water's going to drain. Think of curb and gutter. So just think of that as kind of this one spot here, this low point on the edges of the road. We're going to call it the gutter, kind of throughout this webinar. So water drains to the gutter. Well, we can see kind of what that looks like. And we're not talking about inlets yet. We're just talking about there is a street, which is pavement. Water rains on that, and you can see here that, right, water begins to kind of fill up the gutter, the sides of the road. In fact, that's the reason that roads are only, they call it crowned, is so that water runs off to the sides. So what's happening here? What we're going to look at is we have this section that's all wet, right? It rained here. That is what we're going to call the gutter spread. That's the water which ran to the side of the road, but is filling up against the curb, spreading out into the road. Okay, so that's gutter spread. You can see in this road to the right, we have, that actually goes all the way across the street. Okay, not really what we want. So that's kind of the punchline for the next thing that I'll say here is that why do we start to care about this? Well, clearly, I think of myself, I like to drive on roads and get where I want to go, right? So beyond just me getting to work, getting around town, emergency vehicles, all sorts of items rely on this roadway infrastructure. It's critical. So we really can't have the runoff filling up all of our streets so we can't drive on it. Kind of a no-brainer. So the big item here is just safety. For a million reasons, we can't let runoff fill up our streets. Okay, so we need some form of drainage relief all along our roads to get water, kind of to pull water or to kind of let water run off from our streets to a manageable level. These kind of drainage relief points, that's what I'm going to call inlets, right? So again, pretty high level here, but we have inlets down our streets to let water run off so that there's a manageable level of spread. Okay, that's a pretty key way to say that. So there's always going to be some water in the street, but having it be spread out a few feet away from the curb is okay. Maybe you can let it go all the way out so there's just one lane of traffic. That's kind of what the picture on the left is showing. Maybe there's one lane of traffic in the middle which can actually move. Maybe that's acceptable. A big theme for what we're going to be talking about today is the fact that the exact requirements might change every single city across the US. Every single county might have slightly different requirements and standards for the allowable amount of spread which can occur. Well, that's the engineer's job, is to keep the spread and design to make sure it's below those levels. Okay. All right, so how do we figure out those drainage relief inlets? How do we figure out how those work, what their capture rates are? Well, enter in this Federal Highway Administration Manual, the Hydraulic Engineering Circular number 22. Well, we're going to call it HEC 22 in this case. Chapter 4 of this manual is all about pavement drainage. That's what we're looking at. So specifically, how to figure out what those inlets are and should be, and then how to calculate their efficiency. There's really 4 types of inlets. Okay, we could get really crazy in some fringe cases on different things that don't conform to these 4 items, but largely all across the US, there are 4 types of inlets we're going to look at. And now in my mind, I was a consultant largely in the US, though, so we call them inlets here. I happen to work in Australia. They call them gully pits down there. In the UK, they call them gullies as well. So this term might change a bit depending on where you're sitting around the world, but inlets, these are the 4 main types we're going to see, at least in the US. Grates, curb openings, or a combination of those. Some places might call that a sweeper inlet if the curb opening is longer and wider than the grate. So I've got some great pictures I didn't put up here, but I was in Florida. Great examples of sweeper inlets down in Florida where the curb opening is much longer than the grate. That's what you call a combination inlet like that, a sweeper. So Federal Highway Manual set out, how do we let engineers, what's the standard for engineers to sit down and manually write out calculations on our magic engineering notebooks? So you can do hand calculations, figuring out the approach flow to an inlet, what the spread will be, the velocity, the bypass, okay? Pretty prescriptive, right? So they simplified things down to let an engineer work through step by step to figure out those answers. How wide is that spread going to be based on some inlet configuration? Great. There are some issues with this, or else we could just end the webinar right now, right? So a lot of assumptions are acquired. So to simplify things down so that we could just run hand calculations all day long, we have to rely on some things which really aren't standard practice, I'd say, in many cases anymore, or they're just not sophisticated enough. So this whole system relies on instant inflow, right? So that would be a static, rational-based inflow. So Q equals CIA. So that's been around since the 1800s as a way to calculate runoff from a catchment. Most areas, most cities, you're trying to put together some sort of stormwater management protection plan. You're putting together your report. Just using the rational method is not going to cut it. Doesn't cut the mustard. We need to use a full hydrograph approach, even full hydraulic analysis. So this method that we're looking at, that really the Federal Highway Manual outlines and most groups try to adhere to for the inlet portion of their exercise, really simplified, kind of behind the standard in hydraulic assessment. And on top of all that, it's really isolated, right? So we're looking at really simple calculations for one inlet at a time. And do they influence each other? It's really kind of an unknown. That's terribly difficult to figure out in hand calculations. So how do engineers do this now? So I'm going to really kind of lump this into three categories. There's the prescribed method we just looked at. So on the left side, starting with the hand calculations themselves, working through step by step, as is outlined in the HEC 22 manual. All right, well, maybe someone hired a grad student and maybe they built up an Excel file to help with some of those hand calculations. Okay, great. Maybe there's even some sort of utility. Maybe there was like a postdoc student that came in and made some sort of utility, some sort of toolbox or something, basically a calculator that's just a really pretty version of Excel. Those are all following to the T the prescribed HEC 22 calculations. Okay, they're just perhaps slightly easier to input as you move along there. Other end of the spectrum is we could look at the inlet types that are specified in the HEC 22 Chapter 4 manual within a robust hydraulic modeling tool. Right? So we can have this really robust hydraulic analysis that isn't looking at static flow. It's looking at a full hydrograph or real rainfall records. And it's going to take this dynamic hydraulic model and really try to account for the types of restrictions that would apply at those points. That's not by the book. Okay, so that might be giving much more realistic answers, but that's not necessarily following, right, how some groups might need to report this. So many groups still want these prescribed calculations, but they also kind of want the right answer. You can see in the middle, this comprehensive, holistic design. That's the focus of this tool, XPDRAINAGE, I'll be looking at shortly, a little bit later, where we have tried to really drive these two together. That is the purpose of XPDRAINAGE, is to have robust, fully dynamic hydraulic assessment of your site, which is really the standard practice for most groups. But that lives alongside with, in the same space, as these prescribed calculations. And I'll just make a note here. I know Caitlin, I believe, mentioned it, but we have a whole questions field in the GoToWebinar dashboard. So you have a question, I'm going to try to keep an eye on that as we move along and answer questions as they come up. Anything I don't get to while I'm juggling a couple other things, we'll talk about at the end. Okay, so just know that questions field's there as I move through stuff. So the components of these spread calculations, let's start with the gutter section. That is literally, think of the curb and gutter, that's the edge of the road. So you define the gutter, you define what the roadway looks like, then you define what kind of inlet there is. Make sense so far? So we have the inlet being the literal opening. So we could have that be those 4 different types, right? We could have it be a combination. We could have it be a gutter. We could have it be, there's a location is kind of the term they use, or a condition. Basically in-sag. So there's all the roads slope down to this one point and it all collects there. Think of that in-sag. Or on grade, the road slopes along at a constant slope and the grate is kind of in the middle of that steady sloped area. There's also additional depression depth you could apply if there's a specific kind of inset. I don't know a different way to say that, but maybe an inset depression there on top of the grate. It sets down a little further. There's also clogging, hugely important for areas like, I'm physically based in Portland, Oregon, and things are groovy until about October, and then all the leaves fall off. So the clogging factor is really important to take into account. Like many things with civil engineering, we don't really get to make these all up ourselves. So usually these are fairly prescribed. So you're going to work within a jurisdiction, and they might, really only allow a certain type of inlet to be used, right? Maybe they're always combination and they're always like blank. Or when you're doing an assessment, thou shalt always run this with 50% clogging, just for kind of a really bad, worst case scenario. So a lot of those items, you're not trying to figure out how clogged it would get. That's handed to you, or you make just a really general assumption. So the typical stormwater design, and this is how I had worked as a consultant at one point. Many engineers I work with are all in the same boat. So I'm not pointing a finger at anyone in particular. This is really how most people work. So there's some sort of stormwater management plan, some sort of design being put together. And there's 8, 10, 20 little different boxes to check. Okay, so a bunch of these little individual calculations. So beyond the normal sizing a pond based on certain constraints and pipe sizing, figuring out the catchment runoff and water quality volumes. Oh, well, we're talking now about these inlet capacities and the resultant spread which would occur in our roads. Separate might be also, hey, we need to do a full hydraulic analysis. Usually these are kind of separate tasks that once one's completed, you kind of move to the next. And when you've done all of them, right, you've checked all the boxes, right? There is some sort of guideline that wants you to perform these pieces, right? So you're done, right? You did a good job. Well, the intent, again, it's not just the guideline, but it's the intent of the guideline. The intent of the guidelines are to provide, holistic, sustainable, as in they work in the real world and they don't fail after the first year, sustainable infrastructure. So doing all these items individually in the real world, that's not how they work, right? So that's really what we're going to hope that we can move towards kind of with this XP drainage and some of the workflows I'm going to look at shortly. So what we like to look at is the preliminary design, and that's the terminology used in the Federal Highway Manual. Preliminary design covers a lot of stuff. So that's preliminary design might be some basic rational-based catchment runoff, pipe sizing, pond sizing, and the 2 items we're looking at now, right? There's the inlet capacity and the kind of resultant gutter spread, which would occur. So that's all this preliminary design. Those, and the big focus of XP drainage is making those really easy to put together, and they're such simple individual calculations. Let's kind of automate getting those lined up. But there's also this whole other part of the process, which is maybe a real dynamic assessment, looking at this complex full hydrograph discharge reductions, and really based on a full hydraulic simulation. And the key is that it's not just, right, go and through and check these different boxes and you're done. Pardon the pun, but they really wash back and forth. right? So you might set out your preliminary design and then you run that through a hydraulic simulation and find out that, well, as we'll look at here shortly, my initial inlet setup and configuration really didn't take into account the fact that there's all this bypassed flow, or that my site really behaves differently when all my facilities kind of cascade one to another. Okay, well, we run a full analysis for a reason. We can see what happens. We get a more realistic view of things. So let's drift back to those preliminary designs, and let's, based on that information, scale things up by 20%, or move things around in the preliminary space and drift back to the hydraulic dynamic simulation. Moving back and forth ultimately is going to give us not only informed decision making, but that's how we get that comprehensive design. There's really no other way to do it. Okay, and most people don't do this in one space at the moment. Well, that's really kind of where XPDRAINAGE comes in. So before we jump in looking at specifically the inlets in XPDRAINAGE, I'll be looking at our latest release, 2018.2. Just to call it, there's a couple items for those that maybe are using the software or have already seen it. A couple items other than making a real approachable workflow around inlet design is the idea of we've updated some of the algorithm behind our pipe sizing to really kind of get it a minimum excavation, right? Size those, place them as close to the surface based on constraints as possible. Directly edit within this profile view seems a common task, really helpful. And you can load directly Atlas 14 data if you have it or want it. So let's jump in, and I am going to look at really not the whole workflow for a whole project, but just how the inlet pieces come together and how that might kind of sit in this evolution of a full analysis back to a preliminary design. So here is XPDRAINAGE. Happens to be a somewhat complex site, I guess. There's this residential development and a pipe network, and what we're going to look at here is really kind of in line with the idea of XPDRAINAGE, this ribbon view on the top. If you work left to right across the ribbon, you finish your project, right? So I've already loaded in some plan data, a CAD file and whatnot. Imported some items that were here, and we're in this kind of preliminary design space. So we'll start with this preliminary design, and there's maybe more building out this dynamic system. So we already have this large catchment. This is probably overly large, and I kept it that way to really prove a dramatic point here. So this is a very large catchment that all drains down to this inlet. And how do I know that? Well, we're developing the site, so I'm going to grade it this way. I happen to have a surface loaded, so I'll just, for grins, I can, what we call deluge the site. So I can run basically a little bit of rain on this surface, and we can see how the water moves down the street. So all of this catchment drains down to this inlet. If this inlet can't grab all the water, right? If there has to be bypassed flow, that's going to bypass down to this next one. Ultimately, everything then kind of would run down the street. That's really the setup for this exercise. So what we're going to do, let's look at this catchment. Okay, so again, that preliminary sizing versus dynamic sizing. So I happen to have, I guess we all, with XPDRAINAGE, you can input what matters. If you're just doing preliminary sizing, great. This is the rational method, right? Q, flow, equals CIA, right? It's land use, area, and intensity. Enter that in here. You also have a range of options for a full hydrograph robust runoff calculation. I happen to be using a modified rational approach. For those that aren't familiar, the rational method has no concept of time. It's just flow that occurs forever. Well, you can try to make volume out of that by making a bit of a kind of a triangular or kind of a benched hydrograph or hyetograph, so to speak. So that's what we're doing here. So I have a 5-minute timer concentration. I could change that per my different storm events I'm going to run, so on and so forth. So in short, I have my preliminary sizing and my modified rational. So I should have a full hydrograph through this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect. I can right click and I can connect my inflow to this inlet. So the first thing I'm probably going to want to do, all this water drains here, and let's set up an inlet. So under my inlets tab, you see I have a range of different options. Automatically, you can see this incoming item. It says, hey, this catchment is incoming. Let's pick one of these restrictions. I could restrict it by a percentage of incoming flow. Well, we're all here to talk about HEC 22 stuff, so let's look at that. So of the two pieces, the gutter and the inlet, I'll define the gutter first. Now this is usually pretty standard stuff, and this is probably something that might, be kind of dictated for you. The shape of the road, the slope of which it's going to occur, so on and so forth. So kind of the usual suspects here on this project site, and I happen to have the details for the gutter. Now I also have the inlet, a little more exciting. So I could look at, I have grate, I have curb, I have combination, slot, so on and so forth. I could look at curb inlet. I could look at that in sag. You could spend a lot of time with all these combinations. So in this case, I'm going to look at a combination to make it nice and complex. So an on-grade combination inlet. Great. Again, these might be pretty called out for you, pretty standard. I'm going to add a kind of a sweeper inlet here. So I'll have my grate be a certain length and width, and then ultimately the curb opening itself. So it'll be 6 feet long. And we move through here, no extra depression, ultimately 30% clogging. So see, by typing that stuff in, and nothing really changed in the plan view, but we can look at what we have here. So I happen to have this magenta line is our flow path. So we can see that we have all of that catchment on the surface draining to this inlet, and we're restricting it at the top of this inlet. What gets in goes into the pipe system. What doesn't, we need to define the bypassed flow. Now at this point, I've connected an inflow area. I could jump right into sizing this inlet. This is also on the preliminary sizing tab under size inlets. If you let the software know a little information, it can help. So I could jump right into, based on the catchment properties, I could go, I've selected this rainfall table, and I could select different runoff events, so on and so forth. Right? You can see here, 10-year event. This is a big area. We've got over 5 CFS cruising down that street. Okay, and we can see what these charts look like. So here's the gutter, and here's the inlet that we just typed in, and we could modify and tweak to capture some of this flow. So right away I go, hey, this isn't going to work. And I could change these restrictions. I could change the clogging, right? Make that 0. And we'll see on the fly, all of these would change. I think there's also the section view. So you get the idea, right, of what's happening here. The really important item conceptually to understand is that as far as the HEC 22 manual goes, it always refers to gutter spread. You'll see I only list gutter spread on here one time. It's the spread of water away from the curb upstream of the inlet. So I'm going to say that again. The inlet doesn't matter at all when we're calculating gutter spread. Yeah, sure, knowing how wide it is when it's bypassed downstream, yeah, the inlet's going to be important. But technically, it's just the gutter So we basically give it some sort of inflow and a shape to flow down, and it figures out how wide that is. That's what's happening. So the gutter is spread out. Okay, that's how wide it is. Then we capture some in our inlet, and that's when, of course, these inlet details come to be. We could override any of this stuff. You know, I can say, all right, you know, what's actually just 1.2 CFS, so on and so forth. Okay, so we can jump in here and tweak this and make this work. I have an overly large area, so there's lots of bypass flow. I want to see that through the system here shortly. Get the idea. There's one other item in here, dynamic. Well, you know, we'll look at that in a moment. But so we could size based on manual entry. You could set this up just based on, hey, if you have to design towards a steady intensity, you could set all those things up. Okay. So we could have just designed to be done with just one inlet. Usually you don't have just one. Let's set up the bypass flow path. So what we're going to do is I'm going to right click on this item here, and bypass connection. I happen to have a representative roadway gutter. Now, what just happened here? There's this little radial menu, and it says inlet. Well, that's the inlet we just defined. So water is going to run down the street. Oh, and you'll see I have two other inlets I get to pick from. This one is the road gutter. So we'll see that now. So I go look at this manhole. I've already set up the inlets. So you can see here, road gutter is this HEC 22 inlet. So we happen to have water going from this manhole. What doesn't get in goes to the next one. If that inlet can't handle the water, well, we better let it go down the road to the next one. Same exercise. I have a representative road gutter section. I can say, hey, which inlet is being bypassed? That road gutter. And right on down the street, again, hey, attach it to an inlet. Fantastic. Now this representative road gutter here, you can see just a triangular channel in this case. Based on the surface, based on the manholes, that's all kind of automatically set for us. Anything in red is a value that I manually typed in. I happen to import a lot of this pipe network from CAD, and it kind of went a little crazy. AutoCAD tends to store many, many, many decimal places. So if we're going to follow what they have, that's why it's pretty pedantic out here. If I was doing this from scratch, I might not go out 8 decimal places. But that's why that exists, okay? So now we happen to have a flow path. Let's look at that. I'll add in, let's see if I click this one, and I want to know what's downstream. It gives me which option. All right, there's 2 different paths for water to flow. I want to look at those above ground gutter. Same down here. I might actually just connect this all the way downstream to the end of this project site. So let's take a look at that. So here is our gutter of our road. Water will be bypassed if it can't get in. And we will find, I'll make this a bit wider. We'll find that, well, this pipe's a bit undersized. So we could kind of on the fly change these values. And I'll say maybe it's, I don't know, 12-inch pipe. So through this profile, I tend to personally work in this space a lot. I think it's really useful to see things in profile. But I'll set it back to 6 inches, mostly to prove a point here in a second. So I have basically designed, I've set the size for this. I want this to have a lot of bypass to look at some cascading effects. So without any further sizing, I could go in and do preliminary sizing for all these. I'm just going to run a full hydraulic analysis. This takes so quick I can't really talk to it. It takes, 6 seconds. I'm actually running, I think, 8 or 10 different rainfall events, and I happen to be using different phases. So I'm running the 11 a.m. Webinar, and I also have a final design. These phases are scenarios. Basically, you can have, and I usually have, 6 different ideas of how I want to approach stormwater on a site. So this would be a way you can have these totally different kind of models all together, compare results, so on and so forth. So I'm sticking just with this one. What just happened? So first thing I might do, I'll actually rename this flow path. I'm going to call this the road bypass. First thing is, okay, I want to show the profile. And right away on this undersized pipe, I'll go to the 2-year storm. Ooh, it's about to kind of cause some flooding. 5-year storm, we're popping out the top of this manhole. This is just way undersized. So the first thing I might want to do, I ran a full analysis. Okay, well, maybe I want to go and look at some pipe sizing. We have something called the pipe sizing wizard. I've given some demonstrations on this in the past. Basically, here's all the details of the bypass flow path that I've defined. Next, I'm going to size to the 10-year event. Great. I only want to upsize pipes. You can get into automatically adjusting the cover levels and whatnot. I've got everything locked down. So all it's going to do is upsize the pipes where they're too small. And that note even said it's not going to adjust the triangular channels, which I don't want it to. So all that talk just to figure out that, yeah, that 6-inch pipe, make it a little bit bigger and you're probably going to be okay, right? So that's how that worked. A different chapter of the HEC 22 manual, I believe chapter 7, you could dive in, and that's actually what we have emulated here, is we follow that routine, and you could look at the pipe sizing results and report per chapter 7 of the HEC 22 manual. So now, okay, I upsized the pipe. Let's maybe just run this again, just for grins. You can imagine that's going to have a lot better flow through that pipe. I just want to look at the profile right away, and you get the idea. I'll jump to a much larger storm event, and we'll see that we have, all right, these did change a little bit if you didn't catch it, but that 12-inch pipe is going to handle this flow a much different way. Okay, great. So we sized our pipe network. We can go in and look at some of our inlets now. So you can see how there's this back and forth between the full answer, the dynamic hydraulic results, make some tweaks, go back again. The point is it's all in one space, seamless in XPDRAINAGE. Let's go back and I can go to this preliminary sizing. And I'm actually going to look at, I want to look at the bypass. So here is manhole 2 right here. I want to look at the dynamic flow. So based on, I could change this. Let's see, I'll go back to the 10-year storm event. You see how, like, kind of on the fly, all the results update. So based on the dynamic, much more comprehensive results, we got about 3.2 CFS hitting that inlet. And that inlet's not going to be able to hold on to that, okay? So we could right away go in and start making adjustments to capture 3.2 CFS. Now you'll see there's probably a big difference between what we had in our plan view. So if I said 10-year, oh, it's 0.67 CFS. So by sizing this inlet based on the contributing catchment, this catchment's really small, right? We have less than a CFS getting this inlet, right? We happen to have some clogging. There'll always be a little bypass in that case, but great. So if we were sizing individually, like let's say I would have done in the past, let's just size each inlet and call it done. We're going to have some issues. So in this case, we actually have way more flow hitting this inlet and bypassing. And we can see then, of course, bypassing downstream. So we have this sag inlet down here with a pretty small contributing area. Okay, well, dynamically, we've got 1.8. We can see what our plan data would look like. I think this is set to the wrong inlet, but the plan data, right, is generating much smaller results than the You see a very, very small inflow off of this catchment. So those are the ways you'd want to work back and forth between your dynamic design, your preliminary design, all across this. We could jump right now that we maybe got our dial the inlets in, dial the pipe network in, maybe we go to the end of our project and size a pond, place a pond in here for mitigation. We'll see here's a pipe that we've marked as red. Ooh, well maybe that's an undersized pipe. Let me go to I'll go to the results for our connections. Oh, look, here's one that's flooding. Okay, so right away, you're gonna see in plan view, oh, there might be an issue. Go in and fix it, rerun some results, back and forth to dial this in, okay? And again, my name is Zach Sample, and we have a whole team here that does this stuff. So we have a whole technical support and resource team for engineers that to call for comments, thoughts. We do teach classes, whatnot. So there's a large technical group, well beyond just myself, that deals with this. So again, I think that's about it. Let's wrap it up. I think thanks everyone for joining today. And again, my name is Zach Sample, and I appreciate your time.